Earlier this summer, I did a sermon on the story of the binding of Isaac in Genesis. Story of the time when Abraham was apparently ordered by God to sacrifice his son. And there was one thing that really kind of struck me about that story in particular. See, in that story, every time Abraham is addressed, first by God, and then by Isaac, and then by the angel of the Lord, he responds in exactly the same way. And Abraham doesn't answer like you or I might. I mean, if somebody calls out your name, how do you respond? Scott or Dad, right here in my house, what will I respond? What do you want? I might say, assuming, of course, that the person calling me has a request of me, something they want me to do, perhaps. Or I might respond with, I'm down in the basement, or something like that, if my assumption is they're looking to come to where I am. Or, and doesn't this happen a lot these days, if I'm in the middle of something, I might respond and say, I'm practicing my sermon, or whatever else I'm doing. And of course, that's something that can be said with varying degrees of frustration or annoyance. I mean, never by me, of course, but I understand in this world that there are sometimes people who get annoyed by interruptions. So, to sum it up, when we respond, we tend to respond in a way that assumes that the person who's calling us wants something from us, either something we've got or something we can do for them, right? And we do all of that without even thinking about it, because it comes naturally. We assume that everything in this life is about what we've got or what we can do for others of value or significance. In fact, that is the central assumption of capitalist societies, that work and possessions are the only thing that give value to life. And we live in such a society. And so we assume that's how everybody thinks. We assume that's how everybody always has thought. And that's why it kind of struck me that Abraham responded to God or these others very differently. Abraham didn't say, what do you want? Or I'm in my tent, or I'm washing the camel. No. Abraham responded, we are told, by saying, here I am. Here I am. And obviously he responded that way because that was a Hebrew idiom. That was the normal way for Hebrew-speaking people to respond, a common phrase used by many people. And of course, that fact alone tells us a whole lot about the people who spoke ancient Hebrew. They weren't as task or possession-oriented as we are. And so they responded differently from how we do. And that made me think that maybe they could teach us a few things about how we might respond differently. So I decided to look a little bit closer at what it is that Abraham actually says. And his response in Hebrew is, in fact, just one word. When God calls, Abraham says, Hineni. Hineni. And the best English translation of Hineni is, in fact, here I am. But, of course, the Hebrew phrase doesn't mean exactly that, because there's no such thing as a perfect translation. For one thing, in what Abraham says, there is no verb. No verb. The word that Abraham actually uses is a common Hebrew word that was used to indicate things. So it was the word that you use, for example, when you pointed at something. Where's the TV remote, somebody might ask, and you would point and say, Hine. There it is, right? In the old King James Version, the Hebrew word was often translated as behold. And one of the things you quickly notice when you read the King James Bible is there's a lot of beholds. Apparently, people said Hine all the time in ancient Hebrew. Now, of course, nobody really says behold in English anymore, and so more modern translations tend to use words like look or see, but actually the Hebrew word doesn't have anything to do with vision. It was just a way of indicating the spoken equivalent of pointing. So what is it that Abraham really is saying when anyone calls him in that story? Basically, he's pointing at himself and saying, hear me. Voila! Ta-da! That's what he's saying. And I want you to understand how different that is from how we tend to respond when somebody calls us. And all of this actually matters because that same word, hineni, here I am, appears in our reading this morning from the book of Exodus. And of course, this is a very important story. The story of perhaps the most important experience anyone ever had of the presence of God. In this story, God appears to Moses and appears to him in a burning bush. And let's remember just where Moses is at this point in his story. Despite growing up as a prince in Egypt, he has come to recognize just how wrong things are in Egypt, how evil slavery is, basically. And even though he himself has apparently benefited from slavery all his life, he has come to realize the evil that is in it. And as you might imagine, this has created a kind of a moral crisis for Moses. And we're told that Moses did initially try to do something about it, about what he saw was wrong with the world. When he saw an Egyptian taskmaster beating a Hebrew slave, he intervened and ended up actually killing the Egyptian. This was, to be clear, not a good plan. Basically, he took a really bad situation and made it worse. And Moses ended up running away from the consequences of his actions. And at this point, it seems Moses kind of gave up. He recognized the world is not right, and he's just withdrawn into the desert. It seems he has lost all hope that things might get better. And I think a lot of us could probably sympathize with Moses at this point in his story. But if Moses is going to find hope for a better world, and if he's given up on making it happen himself, he's only left with one option then. He needs to find God. And God does appear to Moses. That's the good news in this story. But God also appears, kind of famously, in this very strange epiphany. God appears in a bush that is on fire. And I gotta say, could there be any other way to speak about God appearing that is timelier than that right now? Because haven't we been talking a whole lot about burning bushes and trees recently? We've just gone through a spring and summer, now the beginning of a fall, where we have seen out of control fires all over the place. This summer we saw a record number of wild forest fires spread from the Northwest Territories to British Columbia, Alberta, Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec, the Maritimes. And for the first time that many of us can remember, these weren't just fires off in the distance somewhere. We experienced the effects of them firsthand as smoke enveloped our cities and made it dangerous for people to breathe outdoors. And of course, this is not just about Canada, as distressing as that was, but we've seen this all over the place, in places like Greece and Hawaii, devastated by out-of-control fires. So it kind of seems like a perfect time to ask the question, can God speak through burning trees? Because maybe we need to hear something from God, and I think God can. I think there's a powerful message in all of these burning trees recently. And it is a message, a pretty clear message, that we need to make some changes in how we live in relationship to this fragile earth. But, maybe I'm wrong. Because you know what? It seems like a lot of people didn't hear any such message. Or if they did hear it, they were more concerned about other things that they would call important, like keeping that old economy humming and allowing the rich to get richer. But if God can and does speak through burning trees, how is it that many don't find God, don't hear God's voice today? So maybe this is a question we can ask Moses, because he saw a bush burning, and bushes have been burning forever. And yes, it's as if we're bound to make a record on wildfires today, but I suspect God has been present in and speaking through burning trees for a long time. So how was it that Moses recognized God's presence in that bush when a whole lot of other people had gone by that bush and never seen it, never suspected that God might be in it somehow? Well, this is where I think it's important for us to understand how it was that Moses replied when God called out to him. Because when God called to Moses, Moses replied, "Hineni." He said, "Here am I." Voila! Ta-da! Hear me. And in that moment, Moses proclaimed himself to be present. He didn't reply like we tend to. He didn't say, I'm busy with the sheep, or I'm worried about the slaves, or what do you want? He just said, "Hineni, here I am." It makes me wonder. Maybe the reason why we don't have experiences of God is because of that. It's not that God is absent. It's not that God doesn't appear or speak. It's just that we're so busy being busy and concerned with what our people are expecting of us that we just can't stop and be present with God in the moment. So maybe we need to learn something from the ancient Hebrews and how they responded to God in this world. The fact that we are so task-oriented, so materialistic, may be the very thing that's preventing us from experiencing the presence of God that I believe is still very much active in this world. So maybe we do need to develop the mindfulness, the self-awareness to be able to say, "Hineni, here I am." There's also one other thing that I haven't mentioned, but I think also might have helped Moses to experience God. We are told that when he turned aside to see this burning bush, he did not do so simply because it was a bush that was burning. He noticed something unique about how it was burning. The bush was blazing, it says, yet it was not consumed. And honestly, I'm not quite sure how you would notice that fact about a burning bush. I've looked at things that were on fire, not to mention dramatic wildfires in the wilderness, and you know what usually strikes me about them? How powerful they are. The heat, the smoke, sometimes even the noise. What I don't tend to pay attention to is how quickly the fire is consuming what is fueling it. That seems like something you'd have to very specifically pay attention to, watch over a period of time to even realize it was happening. So it seems to me that maybe another reason why Moses was able to experience God was because he was paying attention to what we tend not to pay attention to. We seem to be trained to pay attention to what's noisy, what causes harm, what causes destruction. And you know why we do that? It's exactly what social media has been training us to do for a long time now. The algorithms that control the content on Facebook and Twitter or whatever it's called and these other sites, They're all tuned to present you with the stories that'll get you upset and angry, because that's what drives online engagement. Well, Moses, at this point, has already tried anger. He's already tried fiery deeds. When faced with injustice in Egypt, he acted, and look how that turned out. So now he seems to be ready for something different. And so he pays attention to something else. He pays attention in the midst of all of the fire and destruction to what is miraculously able to survive. And I think in the context of the situation in Egypt, that situation that he's kind of given up on, that means that he is suddenly aware now that despite their fiery trial of slavery that the people are suffering from in Egypt, they have somehow survived. They have not been consumed. They maybe even thrived a little bit. And so what's happened here is that Moses is being confronted with the possibility of hope. And I think that's the other thing that allows Moses to experience God by that bush, because he's suddenly open to finding hope even in the direst of situations. And I think that might also be what sometimes prevents us from experiencing God in this world. If all we can see is the flames, if all we can see is what causes us to give up hope, I suspect that the experience of God will continue to elude us. But once we open ourselves, even a little bit, to the possibility of hope, I believe the presence of God will shine through. Because God is alive. God is here. God is acting in this world, acting for hope and looking for you to act alongside. God's got it all under control. The only question is, where are you? And will you say, Hineni, here I am? Lord God, teach us to be truly present so that we might encounter you in this world. Amen.